Good morning, everybody, and happy everything because we are here globally, right? Thank you to all the people online wherever you're at. I'm Simmons, Jendayi. I'm so excited to be with you today. I work at NYU too in the School of Liberal Studies. And if, yeah, all of the presenters can join us up here. And please, let's have another round of applause for their fantastic presentations. And also, while they're coming up, another special thank you to D'Angela for her magic. Yeah. Okay, that sounds great. Thank you. Everyone, your presentations were awesome, so thank you for that. And I'm excited because there were so many connections between them. But you know which one I'm going to start with, right? Not putting Black people into a hole, right? Like, we are so diverse, and I felt like all of your presentations talked about that. So one of my first things I wanted to explore to all of you, I would love if you could respond, whether it's from the aspect of storytelling or geographies or color and mental health. Why was it so important, and what were some inflection points where you saw in Purple Rain there was a focus on various types of Black people not falling into tropes? And I think to the point of geographies, something that I see in a lot of movies and just in society generally is that as Black people come into successes, there's a sense of you can be ashamed of certain things. Like, success means you don't relate to a rural background or your country roots or things like that. So points where Purple Rain really said we can have that diversity, but we don't have to play off and make one thing bad and one thing good. Black folks not being one monolithic thing, and geographies not being something to weaponize or play against each other.
Yeah, I guess I can start. But I think that's exactly right, right? It's unfortunate, I mean, for all the different reasons that the characters that Prince had in mind, right, didn't kind of show up in ways that we kind of see in that first plot summary. Because I think it probably would have been a lot more obvious and, right, more explicit where, I think Black people still kind of think of Purple Rain as a Black movie. I think the first times I was even seeing it, it was played on BET as a kid, right? And so, but what more could have been to be able to say, just sit in Blackness and just kind of work through or see how these different characters, even though other characters are and races are represented, it still is steeped in Blackness and how moving about. And I think it's even important for a place like Minneapolis, in particular, because maybe I didn't put it out as much. I think this idea of resisting to say, Black people do have a place. I was talking to Twyla the other day. It was like, what's coming out of Purple Rain, yes. Who talked about the iconic look? Oh, it was author talking about the iconic look. I think the other thing that really gets known is like Minneapolis. Minneapolis gets known at the same time, like, on this broader global perspective as Prince does. And they are intertwined and put together. And I think that is a beautiful act of resisting in terms of having a place and then having all of these different types of Black people potentially have been, that could have been, right, characterized and dealing with different hardships, struggles, triumphs, using their talents to do something different and move about the world and not be situated in one and limited in terms of these physical boundaries and interact with each other and others. I think that would have been an awesome thing to see. We get some of it, but clearly not enough.
Thank you. Anybody else have a contribution? Okay. All right. So I really enjoyed, Robin, when you brought up the importance of Prince hiring his friends for the movie, and I know that there has been a lot of talk about Apollonia and Vanity and different people who could have been in the movie, but how do you think that that shaped things in terms of hiring friends and the familiarity that stayed in Purple Rain, even as it progressed from Dreams to Purple Rain, having those friends and showing the nuance of the characters?
I think for me, it makes it more real. And I saw an interview with Morris recently, and he was saying how he went through the script and they were like, "Would you say that?" And he was like, "No, I would never say that." So he went through and was like, "No, I would say this instead." So, like, there is like, it makes it more real because I do think there was also this underlying thing with him and maybe with Lisa and Wendy in the beginning.
Yeah.
Like, all the stories that were kind of in there were based on some truth. All the people were based on some truth. And I think, too, the story of his parents was, I believe that was also taken from Vanity's experience. Like, I think they both had a set of abusive situations in their life. And he took from both of those when he rewrote it with William Blinn, I guess. So it just made it more real. And I think that's why we all connected to it. Like, you know, I didn't come from an abusive household, but I came from a household that had some issues. And as a quiet, shy little Black girl who was a little bit weird and artsy, like, I really connected. Like, these felt like my friends, like people I would know, people I wanted to be like when I grew up. Like, I couldn't wait to be in my 20s and go and hang out at the First Avenue with like all the like cool Black kids, because like there was nobody in my school like me. So I think that it just brought home a realness to have those people that he was so familiar with, that he grew up with, that he like knew for so long, be in the movie with him.
I love
And
it.
it's probably cheaper.
Yeah, definitely.
They probably had something to say about that. Should it have been?
Yeah.
I think it also comes back to that authenticity, doesn't it? You know,
Yes.
that chemistry between the characters and that sense of authenticity that really comes through. I think that's the thing that many of us hung on to. It's yeah, and it still holds up, I think.
Yeah, it's skipping ahead a bit, but I thought about that when you mentioned, Robin, about how Morris was so mean and cruel, but even as he was saying that stuff, he didn't want to say it. And you could see that sorrow and shame like there. He didn't have to wait until after he did it. He knew he was dead wrong.
Yeah.
But yeah, the authenticity of friends and when you're hurt and you're lashing out. You were about to say something.
Yeah,
Adam.
at the same time that we acknowledge that authenticity
Yeah.
and a kind of autobiographical element or elements to the story, I don't want us to lose track of Prince's skills as a storyteller, right? As a creator of narrative, of story. I think sometimes there's been a misunderstanding about the film that it's almost a documentary of Prince's young life. And no, it's a made-up story, and it was made up by Prince. So yeah, again, absolutely autobiographical elements, friends cast in the film, but this is something that was structured by Prince and his imagination.
Definitely. And when you mention that, it makes me think of another symposium and the idea of people really like loving Purple Rain because it's fantastic and it's a first, a lot of the things that you were mentioning, Kirsty, but also that habit of people not being able to let go of the idea of interracial parents and why, and what does that mean, and that not being like literal life, and people rejecting that, how that relates to a magical idea versus a respect as a storyteller and as a person, right? Like Black doesn't need to be less than, right? But why are we holding on to that idea of interracial as better? And we can maybe relate more to the movie with that. And so I love being in a room like this and with everybody online, because I think we're folks who say like, no, you know, we can take from the movie and then also reflect it back to ourselves. Yes. Yeah. Yep. Yep. Okay. Okay, we're gonna take a question from. Oops. Oh, thank you. Yes. We're going to take a related question from Camila Cummings, Professor Camila Cummings, about the mention of Minneapolis. Brilliant job, Crystal. How do you think Prince's work as a Black geographer and world maker in creating his concept of Minneapolis has impacted the way we think about and experience Minneapolis?
That's a great question. So I took my job at University of Minnesota 2 years ago, about almost 2 years ago now. And I have to say, I mean, Prince was a big draw. I said I can live in Minneapolis and just do all my Princing.
And you are doing.
And that's actually what I do. But what was the last part of experiences?
And how we view Minneapolis.
How we view, yeah. So that I would have never thought of Minneapolis in my life. Now, I was the person who said, you know, when Robin, you mentioned Michael Jackson, I was like, Gary, that's where I'm from, Gary, Indiana. So it's no shade to Minneapolis in the sense of like, because how many people are checking for Gary, Indiana? Not that many. But yeah, Minneapolis doesn't mean anything to me without Prince. And I think, you know, even the experiences that I have as a Black woman, it is hard to live in Minneapolis. I'm not going to say anything different. But, right, this idea, this imagined world that Prince provided through the, you know, all the Princing and the purpleness and the, you know, I know I can get good live music in Minneapolis. Like, I know that I can do that. Other parts of life, right? So for me, like as a Black woman living in Minneapolis, like Prince saves Minneapolis. It almost makes it possible and bearable to be in a place that, I mean, you know, murdered George Floyd, has a lot of issues, racial issues, a lot of racial tensions, people not necessarily wanting to deal with race. I think that is another layer of this that could be put onto this. Prince is kind of putting this race into that, and so how much does he understand how people actually deal with race in that space, that he understands how this film needs to get made, or why is it so important that it does still stay in Minneapolis? I think at a time when most people don't think of Minneapolis, weren't thinking of Minneapolis, and then he kind of gets to be the face of it. And so to make this film and insist that it's there, he never outright says right in that plot summary that this is Minneapolis. But we just know through the pushing of getting the film made that it has to be made there. So I think people, you know, who know Prince, I don't think that Prince shows up enough. There are a lot of music murals now. I still don't think Prince shows up enough in Minneapolis for the impact that he's had historically and culturally. Yeah.
Thank you. We have a few people who are interested to know about the importance of Prince as a well-crafted lyricist, as a songwriter, as a storyteller, and why that isn't explained more, and especially how that shows up and has an impact on Black songwriters who were historically marginalized in a lot of different ways, financially, attribution, et cetera. So if anybody has a response to that. Adam, that seemed like it connected to you.
It's, you know, it's another level of Prince's craft that I think is often overlooked or taken for granted. We in this room all know that Prince is a brilliant lyricist. And yet, I must say, speaking personally, that as I began to review, you know, and I was looking through these two lenses of, you know, narrative versus lyric poetry, and just felt astonished at the range of his songwriting, the number of narratives, the number of story songs. I really think has no comparison. And then at the same time, I was in working through his songbook, I was astonished anew by the intensity of the feelings that are expressed in the non-narrative songs. So I think he's a great craftsman as a lyricist, and maybe a little bit ironically, that's overshadowed by his music and also his multiple skills as a performer. So I think, you know, there's this embarrassment of riches kind of behind which Prince, the lyricist, hides a little bit. So maybe that's an opportunity for scholarship moving forward.
Yeah, I was just going to say maybe that's someone needs to do a conference on that.
I would think so, yeah.
But also, isn't it about his positioning as well? The way he was positioned by the music industry, perhaps as well. I think there was I think he really pushed Purple Rain because he wanted to be taken seriously in different spaces, and I think that maybe has something to do with that as well, and the lack of his lack of attention to his lyricism.
I think there was some of that. I also think there's a healthy amount of, and I say that ironically, of course, of racism in the way popular musicians' lyrics are perceived. You know, the if anybody can sort of place him or herself in the tradition of Bob Dylan, then yay. And yet there's a whole other tradition that it seems to me is badly underappreciated.
Absolutely agree.
Thank you. So we have a question here for you, Kirsty, from Blake. Do you think the similarities between the opening of Gimme Shelter and Purple Rain are a coincidence or part of the dialogue between Prince and the Stones, kind of like Nasty Girl?
Yeah, exactly that. Can't add any more. No, but I do, absolutely. And it's, I guess, Purple Rain is many things, isn't it? And it's kind of interesting to unpack what it can be, but what it is, but what it is today. And I think 40 years have passed, and here we all are. And it's still, what amazes me is it has that cultural resonance above all of those, rock documentaries. I think obviously it's not a rock documentary; it's a lot of things. It's a semi-autobiographical film, but the fact that it still resonates so intensely in popular culture for me is just testament to his genius, obviously.
Thank you. Crystal, can you address how Prince's use of New York and all the critics creates a tangible reference point for his utopia, and how that's both effective and problematic? That's coming from Brother Seeley.
Wow.
How is it the utopian?
Yeah, the fact that he uses New York City as the physical or tangible reference point in all the critics for his utopia. How his New York City, how him doing that is both effective and problematic.
I'm going through the lyrics of my song. I don't know. How is New York make it effective and not? I mean, I wouldn't know, right? What would be the experiences that he could have had that would kind of shape how he's kind of experiencing New York versus Minneapolis. But again, I mean, given the populations, just visibly, and probably reception outside of probably being, in his communities in Minneapolis, I'm not, I'm certain he's not kind of experiencing, I'm sure he's experiencing a lot of racism, what I would assume, right? Being in Minneapolis and then coming to a place like New York where, there's probably a lot more to take in, to experience, to be seen, be visible and not visible at the same time in particular ways. I think that is probably what he's getting at, to kind of, situate New York as a more of a utopian kind of a space. I still think that even though you have a lot of diversity and things happening as he's trying to describe in uptown of Minneapolis, is still standing out in a way that's hyper visible, that probably is still causing a lot of harm and violence and unwanted attention, and receiving that in ways that probably, again, it's not that this is an actual utopia, right? But it's happening at less than it probably would have happened in that space. And then experiencing that for somebody who was born and raised in Minneapolis, I'm sure that could, you kind of get inspired to say like, oh, I experienced a little bit less of this or in a different way. And what I imagine that I would want my life to be like, experience it a little bit more. So, yeah. But again, the dangers of it is, as Black people, there are not many places we can go where we're
Exactly.
still not gonna, experience our race in negative ways.
So we have a question here about Jerome. Robin's excellent presentation about Purple Rain and mental health and her mention of Jerome and Morris's relationship made me wonder, what was Jerome's deal emotionally? Thoughts? And I would maybe extend that to just say I thought that it was clear that they were trying to say like there are actions that are problematic, but they didn't want us to see the characters like this person has only good and bad traits. So again, Jerome and Morris's relationship. What was Jerome's deal?
So, the reason why I put that in is I watched Purple Rain again after I had went to see, there was a production of Jelly's Last Jam. And it talks a lot about how Jelly Roll Morton was Creole, and he kind of had this best friend who was darker skinned, and he kind of like, the friend was always helping him, and but Jelly Roll was always like making negative comments about the color of his skin and things like that. So when I watched Purple Rain again, I was like, oh, wait a second. There's some dynamic here that feels really uncomfortable. Like, why is it that Jerome has no life? Like, he can't even get his own woman. He has to get women for Morris. Like, it just felt really uncomfortable. And I think, and maybe it wasn't even an intentional thing that they put that in. I mean, obviously, Morris and Jerome were friends. They were in the band together, and it just sort of happened that way. But how it looks from a different lens, like when you really think about it, is something off about that. There's something off about it. And so that's kind of why I put that in there, because I wanted to examine that. Like, I could write a whole paper on that, and I didn't have enough time, but I wanted to at least explore that as like, what is the mental health state of Jerome, that he would just be this lackey for someone and not have any kind of life of his own. And, like, why would he let Morris just sort of take over his whole life? It's just like, what's going on there? So that's why that's in there. But maybe I'll write about that next time.
D'Angela, I broke it. I tried to look cool, like, where's D'Angela? Never mind, I've just broken it. Sorry. It brought up a screen and it said, you're at the end of the presentation. I knew something was awry. Adam, Robert Loss would like to know, well, first, thank you. And then would like to know, would you be more agreeable to the statement that most songs at least imply a narrative and the one moment aspect is typically a turning point?
I think that's a really interesting idea. I think there's a lot of implied narrative in songwriting, right? Like, I was quoting a little bit, I was quoting from, Bruce Springsteen's I'm on Fire, which is just about desire. But the implication is that, I guess, he's going to act on that desire, right? And so we can sort of project or deduce a narrative. I think we do a lot of that with song lyrics. Still, a full-on narrative is quite rare, except perhaps in Prince's songs. I mean, I haven't done, a thorough survey of narrative songwriting, across the great songwriters of the past 50 years, let's say. But wow, once I started looking into it, I was struck by how many of his songs not only imply the story, but tell the story from beginning to end. That's a special skill, and it's not necessarily a greater or more valuable skill than the classic sort of expression of a moment's feeling, but it's a special skill. And again, the fact that he could do both so well is worth our acknowledging, I think.
Okay, another question, Adam. Do you find that students often conflate a song's video with the song to project a meaning into the song that doesn't exist in the song? That's from Brother Seeley.
I, Seeley. What's with the really hard to answer questions? Am I right? Am I right, Crystal? Actually, I think there's a history since about 1981 of not only students, but critics and academics not so much addressing songs as addressing the visuals of the songs, because frankly, that's easier to write about. And that's, yeah, so that's been the situation. The students, I don't know, like right now, I don't know how tuned in, I just don't know how tuned in students are to videos versus, you know, songs and lyrics. I mean, Kirsty, you were saying you have a sense, or you read in The Guardian that the video is on its way out. I don't know that that's true, but I would venture to say that videos loom less large in the lives of young people than they did, you know, back in the day when MTV and, you know, its competitors were new, where all we talked about was the video. So I don't know, but I will take the opportunity to, you know, to criticize those writers from various various areas who write more about the images, you know, than they do in fact about the music and the lyrics. Yeah.
Can I just chip in there?
Please.
There seems to have been a huge resurgence. Well, I think it's related to the Taylor Swift effect. You know, the whole analysis of the song, of the lyricism of Taylor Swift. I mean, comparing Taylor Swift to Dylan, is that a bit of a stretch?
Or Joni Mitchell.
So? Or Joni, but yeah, I've certainly seen that in academia and via students as well, wanting to use the lyrics rather than the visuals as the material for entry into the kind of critical analysis. So it's an interesting time.
Much less the music.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
again, which as we know, that's the hardest thing of all to actually write about in language. But yeah, that's interesting. So a new emphasis on the lyrics.
Yeah, certainly from my experience, yeah.
Fantastic. Robin, I wanted to know if you could expand a little bit more on the cyclical and generational traumas during your presentation when you were talking about that. And you mentioned women as negative distractions in some characters' views, particularly the kid. But I wanted to think about that a little bit more, because when I think about Purple Rain, the characters that first come to mind are the men first. But I think there's a lot to be explored with the women characters too. And so I guess I'm interested in, yes, men and how they're treating women and thinking about women and how that relates to cyclical and generational trauma, but also when we view films like this and the allowances we make, how we struggle with it, or maybe more specifically how I struggle with it, right? Like what parts do I say, well, that was just back then? What parts do I reflect on and say, and so how does that shape how I think now? So the cyclical and generational trauma and maybe the power of Purple Rain to help us, you know, unravel some of that and go forward.
Yes. So I guess my first thought around all of that is like, when I think of myself, I feel I definitely see things that I've inherited from my mother, just like my nervousness around things. Like, so that's also what inspired me to sort of think about this connection between the father to the son. And that's why I decided to do some research. Like, it's not just learned behavior. There's something that is genetically transmitted between, you know, it's not just like my mom's nervous, so I looked at her being nervous and now I'm nervous. No, there's probably something that happened to one of our ancestors that, well, there's probably a lot of stuff that, a lot of things, honestly, but like that could have been, you know, some people have other traits that they developed from, you know, from slavery or whatever that was carried down. Mine just happens to be like this anxiety. And I see anxiety in my daughter. I see anxiety in my nieces. There's this female thing in my particular family that we all have this level of anxiety that a lot of other people that I know personally don't really seem to have. So there's some connection to something that probably happened to someone in our lineage. So that's why I wanted to explore that. What was the other question?
I got so caught up in your story now. I
Oh.
got to remind myself. Wait, what was it? But I think really thinking about those intergenerational traumas and Purple Rain, because it really does seem like it's trying hard not to keep us on a dichotomy of good or bad, or this can be overcome or it can't be overcome, right? Like, where are we going forward with this? So I noticed the male characters as being the most prominent in the film, but then also their reactions and interactions with women also made me think about how that doesn't get discussed as well, and how this film might help us there, especially women as the bearers of, you hold her.
Mm-hmm.
This is what you do. That's why it's been like that forever. And so it doesn't have to be. We can
Right.
interrupt it, we could disrupt it, but I don't think without reflection.
Right. Well, so in terms of how the women are treated, I think, especially if you consider that this is taking place in Minneapolis, even though it's not expressed that way, there's not that many Black people. And I feel like maybe the Black men we could sort of imagine needed to show some dominance or some strength or something in this extremely like white homogenized society that they're in the center of. So maybe that's why they're extra aggressive. That's one way to look at it. Oh, and I want to say something about this new musical. I hope that I read what they're doing with this, and I know that they're trying to take out a lot of the misogyny and a lot of those things. But I think if you look at it from the perspective of what I've sort of investigated, of like, why is it there? Like, why is this happening? Instead of just taking it out, oh, it's unpretty to look at. Like, yeah, I get that, but there's something else deeper here. There's a message, and if you remove that, you're removing Purple Rain. It's just like, it might as well be like Green Rain. Who cares?
I heard an invisible, folks who are working on this, make sure that you check in with the people who do events like this. Ms. D'Angela does.
Oh,
If you're watching anywhere,
Oh.
she's right here. She's available to help. Yes. Yes. All of the people. Yes.
yeah. So the other thing I was gonna say is that you mentioned the women, like what's going on with the women. So yeah, it's interesting too that Apollonia would like hawk her jewelry. She just met this dude, and she's buying him this fancy ass guitar, and then he smacks her, and then she's still like at the end when she does her song, she's like showing her earring, like. Dude, no, like, this is not working out. You should just go far away from this guy and stay away from Morris too. Like, what is going on with your self-esteem? Like, so there's a lot of layers that could be investigated that so I think people just sort of take Purple Rain at a surface level because it's Prince, it's the music, it's the history that we all have with it. But there are some other deeper stories there if you really like think about it instead of just like glossing over what you remember from when you were 13 like me.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, I knew it was gonna go wrong. Like when she poured the earring and gave it, and then it was like, also I'm with Morris now. It was too close. I knew something bad was about to happen.
Yes.
We have here a question about Warner Brothers saying that they have hired a white actress to play Prince's mother in Purple Rain because the movie would otherwise be Black. How do you think Prince would have felt about that? So Warner Brothers was said to have hired a white actress purposefully to avoid too much Blackness.
Well, in Dreams, like you showed it, like
He
she
said
was
the-
always
well,
supposed
he
to be
didn't
white.
say which parent
Yes.
it was, but right,
One.
the parents are Italian and Black.
Right.
Right, that's what it says in his first
Right.
scripting,
And
so.
in his early interviews, I think he was saying he was Italian and Black.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Am I Black or white? Like, I think that was intentional. I don't think that was a Warner Brothers thing. I don't know if that's true, but I don't think so.
No, that was Prince's idea. That wasn't.
Yeah.
Warner Brothers didn't have anything to do with that decision.
Womp. And then when he changed his mind, he was like, why are people still confused?
Well, that's a whole other situation.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Oh, I like this one. So we have a question. Crystal, you mentioned how the three main characters were from different locations in and around Minneapolis. How do we reconcile that all three parties wanted to make it big and seemingly get out of Minneapolis? So you were talking before about different cities
Get
and how tough
out.
it could be.
Well, when I was reading, I never felt like they wanted to get out of Minneapolis.
Mm-hmm.
They just wanted to make it big and be known again, right? He doesn't necessarily. I can reread, I've been reading it over and over, but I don't know if there's yes, he wants to make it big and he says get the money and all of these things that come along with it. Then he goes into this part about, he really wants his music to be able to affect lives, but it doesn't necessarily put a geographical space, like a location with what it would mean to kind of make it. So that's an interesting, I love that question. Because where would making it mean? But we always see, right, the making it kind of unfolds even in the movie or in this idea, right? The making it happens in the Battle of the Bands kind of space. So that's really interesting. So I still feel like that has a kind of local feel. Yeah.
Yes. Okay. The final one.
And I've learned people from Minnesota, Minneapolis, they don't like they leave and come back, but they don't like to leave. That's what I'm learning. So I think that's even a little outside evidence that I don't think when he's scripting, like summarizing the plot and putting it together, he's really thinking too far beyond.
Okay, for a final question for everyone, when we think about the mental health issues that were included in the film, why do you think that Prince chose the particular ones that were included, the issues that people had for the main narrative characters? What do you think that he wanted us to walk away with?
I would say, don't kill me, everybody, but I think he had a little bit of all of those. I love Prince. I love Prince. You guys know I love Prince. But, if you look at some things that we know about his life, it could be said that, he probably had experienced or was part of, it's hard for me to really say this nicely, but I believe that Prince had some elements of all of those things in his personality. I believe that he was sometimes depressive, maybe not all the times. I believe that he was sometimes emotionally abusive. I do not believe he was physically abusive, but I do believe he had some issues. There was a little bit of narcissism there. He had a little bit of all that stuff.
Mm-hmm.
But, that made him a great artist.
There you go. There you go.
Artists are complicated, so.
Yep. Any other additions? I agree with that. I think that it was maybe a hopeful look at we got all this stuff going on and still, and that we can deal with it, that we don't have to gloss over it. So thank you all for being here
Thank
this
you.
morning.
Yes, you do.